name is Kate Lewis, and I'm a first-year MBA student. I wanted to welcome you to eSports Explosion panel. Today we have a great lineup of panelists. We have Sundance D. Giovanni for Major League Gaming, Mike Morheim for Blizzard Entertainment, Kevin Lin from Twitch, and our own Daryl Morey from the Houston Rockets. This panel will be moderated by Rod the Slasher Breslau, an eSports broadcaster. The panel is going to run till 6 p.m., and after that there's the cocktail hour I wanted to remind you about. Throughout the panel, if you have any questions, you can send a tweet. I'm sure you've heard this a lot today, but please use the hashtag SSAC13 and hashtag 205. And with that, we're going to turn it over to the Slasher.
Hello, everyone. Sundance, Mike, Kevin, and Daryl. Last year on this stage, there was the first ever esports panel here at MIT, and Daryl helped set that up. And Alex Garfield and Day 9 were here, along with Mike and Sundance last year, and now it has returned this year, and things have only gotten bigger just 1 year later. So I want to know from you guys, how has the growth been from 2012 to 2013 compared to the past few years and increase that we've seen?
Sure, I can sort of talk at a high level of what we see on Twitch. So this time last year, February 2012, I'll start with 2011. 2011, I think we're just shy of 5 million monthly uniques watching what was predominantly esports content on Twitch back then. It's certainly diversified a bit. But in 2012, February, we were at 14 million uniques. And then just this past February, we were just shy of 30 million at 29 million uniques per month. On top of that, one of the stats we track the most is engagement. So that's in the form of minutes watched overall and minutes watched per unique per day. And minutes watched overall went from, I think, something like 500 million in 2011 per month to 2.4 billion minutes per month last February. This February was over 7 billion minutes per month, so almost 3x growth from last year. And in terms of minutes watched per unique per day, we're now at about 105 minutes per day. So it's an hour and 45 minutes per day per unique. If you tune into Twitch in a day, you're watching quite a bit of content. Contrast that to about a year ago, which was about an hour.
So I think with Major League Gaming, what we do, for those who may not be familiar with it, is we take the games that folks like Blizzard provide us with, the IP, and create a competitive platform. That competitive platform is then presented as sport. It's literally broadcast as sport. There are commentators, there are professional players, there are players who've retired who are now in the booth. And so what we've seen is, going 11, 12, 13, is our level of engagement has been skyrocketing since we started to use tools like Twitch as a partner for distribution. Our engagement time actually for our big competitions is more like 3.5 hours of tune-in time. And what that means is that someone is coming, they're staying on one of our channels, there are typically 5 that are available during an event for that period of time. That is incredibly compelling to brands and to partners, and it's very exciting because it shows that people are engaged for the activity that we're providing. On top of that, when you break it down, the audience shift has been phenomenal for us. We were incredibly male-dominated historically, and in the past year we've seen that number shift a little bit to 85% male to 15% female, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in our world it actually is. It's tremendous, and I think folks like Mike can back that up in terms of what they've seen with the player side of it. On top of that, the international reach is something that's not available through traditional broadcast methods. Our events will reach 175 countries globally. There's not a lot of countries left for us to actually touch at that point. We're a truly global engagement where fans are both playing or viewing the content for extended periods of time. And one of the amazing differences that we have compared to traditional sport is people are participatory. They don't just sit back and watch, they actually play. Not very many people run out and play football that often, except for maybe on Thanksgiving weekend, unless you're in high school, college, or lucky enough to be paid to do it professionally. What we do is incredibly accessible, and there are clear paths to engagement for those communities.
Mike, are you able to talk about the growth from the developer standpoint?
Well, sitting back and watching what has happened since the last time we were here, we've seen a number of successful events run around the world. We have various different partners that are running in various different countries. Blizzard ran a worldwide competition. We called it the World Championship Series that was held really all over the world, culminating in November in Shanghai. for our Battle.net World Championship event. And so we saw people tuning in from, as Sundance mentioned, all over the world. I think that more and more spectators are really relying on Twitch as sort of the go-to place for viewing content. So at any moment you can just boot up Twitch and see what's going on. And if anything, I think we've found that maybe there's a little too much going on, because we started to run into scheduling conflicts where maybe the players that you would have expected to be at some of the major events couldn't because they had other obligations. That's something that we'd really like to address this year.
Would you guys be able to cherry pick the top 1 or 2 aspects in growth and how those have helped you along the way?
Sure. So for us, it's been just overall audience size. I think we saw 333% growth across our broadcasts. On an event weekend, we'll see 6.5 at its peak million people tune in, about 400 to 500,000 people concurrently. And that's not, we can't relate that directly in an apples-to-apples way to traditional TV, but from a pure slicing of the demographic, 18 to 34, we weigh out very favorably towards things like the BCS games or ESPN broadcasts of the NBA or Major League Baseball. ESPN's audience is actually aging. They're in the mid-50s now. So there's a big challenge for folks to find ways to be engaging and sticky to a younger audience. And what we've seen is that we're not just expanding the number of people who are tuning in, but we're getting younger and retaining audience, right? So for every person who is a 30-year-old fan who turns 31, 32, we're going 18, 16, 17. So our average age is staying right in the middle in that sweet spot, but we're broadening out, becoming more mainstream essentially, but globally as opposed to just in one region.
Kevin, maybe you too?
Sure. I mean, I think the primary driver of growth is just the internationalization of it. We've been focused on building out our platform quality of service just to reach more and more countries more directly, so getting our edge servers as close as possible so that they actually have a good user experience. Beyond that, just a lot of new games are popping up. A lot of developers are now thinking, well, how do I actually build a game that's fundamentally interesting to play, but also interesting to spectate? How do I build tools that make it interesting as an esport? So both of those things have helped a lot, but the developers paying attention in general has really helped boost the growth, because whereas it is a niche within a niche, right? Each individual game community, the folks who watch the esports component, is still a small part of that specific games community. But the fact that the developers are promoting tournaments and leagues and players in the game client through their social media has really drawn more attention to the fact that you can actually watch. I mean, it's just not, for the last year, we did what we could, the players and the teams and the leagues did what they could to promote it, but now that the game companies are involved, it's actually really launched into the spotlight.
Mike, what would be the key factors in continuing the growth in 2013 and beyond?
Well, some of the things that we've been focusing on. So, StarCraft 2 came out in 2010. StarCraft had the benefit of having a long history as an esport. StarCraft 1 was quite popular. It was released back in 1998 and is still played to this day, and is still pretty popular, especially in South Korea. But what we've been focusing on right now, we're getting ready to launch our first expansion, Heart of the Swarm, 2 weeks from now. And I think some of the features in Heart of the Swarm are very relevant. We have really tried to make an effort to help players transition to the multiplayer experience and really help train them transitioning from single player to multiplayer. We have provided better tools for broadcasters like Sundance so that they can customize the observer interface, which is really important because spectatability is, I think, very key. It's important for somebody who isn't familiar with the game to be able to sit down and understand what's happening. So let's see. And then I think that we have a role to play in the esports ecosystem in working with the our various partners to try to create understandable storyline that progresses throughout the year, culminating with a world champion, and allowing spectators to follow where we are in that progress, and hopefully identifying who are the top players.
Sundance, how high is the ease of watching the events to you?
Well, I think it's something that improves constantly. You know, if you look at traditional sports, you could argue that the NFL is a better experience watched from home than in the stadium, right? Because there's a kickoff and then a delay, and then, they're standing around a lot of the time, and there's these breaks in the action. The NBA has done things like, there are timeouts, and the adjustment to the game to help with the flow and the entertainment level are something that leagues struggle with. Major League Baseball with instant replay, does it slow it down? Does it help? What we've had now is, especially with our relationship with Blizzard, is the ability, as Mike mentioned, to have a custom interface where we can help tell the story. So it's not just a question of whether or not you're incredibly familiar with the game, but the mechanics of the game will make sense very early on for a viewer. We're no different, really, than the way that football is broadcast, right? You tune into a football broadcast, and before the game starts, they're going to say things like, well, the team that controls the ball most should win the game. Control your turnovers. There's a vernacular. There are very simple things that are repeated over and over again so that the audience, no matter how familiar, just becomes familiar with them. And we've done that. We've created that vernacular. We've created that same experience. And again, the key for us is, I believe it's become easier and easier because I see it in my kids and their friends who are 10, 11 years old, tuning in and watching, and that just being as engaging to them as the NBA or Major League Baseball, the NFL. And again, you take Major League Baseball for an example. That's a really complicated game to explain to somebody if they've never played it, if they're not familiar with it, and it's very slow paced. But because there's a history and there's tradition there and there's rivalries and there's a regional component to it, it has a very strong fan base. What we're building now with Mike's help and Blizzard's help, and utilizing the tools that we have, is the opportunity to do that from the ground up, and that doesn't happen very often. It's not very often that a new sport gets crafted globally from the ground up, working on the competition layer, the broadcast layer, and the distribution layer all at the same time.
Although competitive gaming and esports has been around for almost 2 decades, it's still relatively young compared to all mainstream sports. What are the similarities between esports and traditional sports that would surprise most people? And I want to start with Daryl, as coming from the traditional sports realm. What have you seen in esports that has shown you?
I would just say anecdotally, the only event that captures the passion and energy that I've been to in multiple years that sort of matches, obviously I'm biased to ours, is I went to an esports event recently. I didn't even go to the big ones. I just went to the one that fit my schedule, and the level of energy and passion, rivals, going to a Duke college basketball game or an NBA game or an international game where they're firing fireworks at each other and things like that. It's really an exciting thing, and you heard how it's growing. In terms of like how it compares and contrasts, I mean, all these sports start small. I mean, all of them start where esports is at. I think people are going to just realize, and marketers get on this first, that if you're going to, I didn't even know ESPN was at 50-year-old age average. I'm feeling that a little bit. So they all start, and like the ones that capture the 18 to 35 and even younger, they're going to be the ones that are the dominant sports later, and they're the ones that build the affinity. And really, people tune in, people care about sports if it's important to them, and it's important to them because there's some sort of affinity to the person playing or the team playing, whether it's regional or the college they went to, or there's some history of why you watch it, and then how important it is to some championship usually, and how much is this one event tie into that major championship. That sort of gets into the importance of it, and esports fits all those things. I'm imagining if when I'll get fired someday in my job, and I'm probably too old to be an esport. Like it's so fun to watch this sport. Like, do we even have an aging curve? Like, when are people best at esports? Like that's the first question Bill James looked at in baseball in 1976. And I'm curious, like, do we even know? I'm asking do we even know, like, when do guys peak? Like, How fit do they have to be? Like just all these really cool questions, I think. Does anyone know? Like,
Well,
actually,
what age is
on that,
best?
yeah.
It lines up really closely to what you expect for traditional sport, right? And so you've got like the late teens into the 20s. There's this moment where the physical acuity and the hand-eye coordination really peak, and then it becomes a question of actually strategy and ability to adjust on the fly, right? Like the cagey veteran thing comes into play. The parallels are overwhelming, and I think that's one of the things that we hoped for when we started our business. But the fact that it's been proven out over essentially the last decade that we've been in business, time and time again, we sit down and we run, we use business intelligence. I mean, I think probably everybody up here uses business intelligence, to help them make better decisions, right? And so for us, we have to understand what that life cycle as a player is, and then what we rotate them to afterwards, right? In the world of baseball, being somebody who thought for one day, for several years in high school and college, I could play professional baseball until I saw a good curveball. Like, okay, then I went to softball, right? And then I went to the work league. So our version of that already exists in esports. And again, it's not about making it common or familiar to the 55-year-old, ESPN watching executive at a media agency. It's about the audience ownership and the audience engagement and participation. We view it as an advantage to a certain degree that we've been off the radar for this long. But with recent shifts, like Nielsen talking about tracking online viewership and comparing it directly to television, pretty soon we're going to be on the radar in a very major way. Because again, how many things can you point to that produce 5 hours of live content tonight with an average tune-in time of 3.5 hours? There's not very many. 175 countries. Super Bowl, according to what I look at, got into 177 countries. It's incredible. The scale of it is big, and it is traditional, and it is mainstream. Maybe not to the generation of people who are out there reporting on what sport is for the majority, but the next generation is already engaged in it, and passionate about it, and is very attached to it. Yeah, we have, I think, at least, and I'm in a great position because I'm watching it happen, I think we've just turned a corner in terms of what people are going to recognize the current version of esports as when esports started, because of the broadcast component, because of the parallels to traditional sport, and because of the fact that it is truly global.
Well, it doesn't take much vision. I mean, if you watch a science fiction movie that's set in the future, there's no like baseball game happening, right? They're showing like two competitors fighting in some holographic field. Like that's what's going to happen. I mean, like our phones now. You go back 20 years, our phones do more than like science fiction people could even dream about. I mean, so to me, like it's just obvious this is going to be a huge thing. And sorry to hijack. I think I'm answering more, but like. I have a question. Like, what differentiates the good and the different tiers of players in esports? Do we know?
Well, we've used the information that's available, and they compare incredibly favorably to fighter pilots, for example, right, or NASCAR drivers. So it's things like visual acuity, obviously, hand-eye coordination, reaction time, decision making. And interestingly, at the same time, you look at their studies, the Harvard Medical Journal, about how surgeons who play video games complete surgeries quicker with fewer errors. Video games are good for you, right? The whole thing was, hey, parents are going to not get behind this. Guess what? They're good for you. Everything in moderation, including moderation, video games are good.
I like that.
But and that's one of the things is my job, more than anything else, is to get out in front of people and show them why they're wrong about the preconceived notion. Right? The preconceived notion is typically from people who've never been to an event or played these games or seen what it is culturally. This is a lifestyle, and it's a lifestyle that in the next decade is going to take everything over. Right? Who would have predicted that boxing would die and UFC would win? Right? A few people. They invested very heavily in something that was nearly bankrupt, and now it's far larger than boxing. Who would predict that an all-digital sport with all digital distribution, with a global baked-in audience, with the support of millions and millions of players and massively successful publishers would become the next biggest thing in the world? Pretty much everybody on this panel. And everyone who doesn't see that will over time, and that's the classic example of having to prove a case. Again, we have seen incredible growth year over year. The viewership increases constantly, and we, I think, above and beyond any other traditional sport, with the exception of maybe golf, have a lifetime attach rate. When you play this, you don't leave it. We've seen it.
Well, I think one big thing there is you can, and you guys do this brilliantly, you can adjust. People are interested when something they're doing is not too hard or not too easy, like a match skill level. And like the brilliance of like the esports is like, yeah, even as you're down into like the softball or the rec league version of it, they match your competitors. Like, you know, just like they match AI as best they can, but they literally match the competitors. So you're always in a competitive game. You're always, you know, trying to move up, but never like, oh my God, I'll never win, and never like, oh my God, I'll never lose.
Yeah, and to that point, one of the things, I use golf as an example because if you play golf, it costs a lot of money, right? And so there's a lot of equipment to purchase. So we have standardized equipment, headsets, mice, keyboards, controllers. That costs a lot of money. They're one of the biggest things within the endemic space that we have in terms of equipment that's produced. So, but I buy my gear, I take it home, I'm playing the same game as somebody else. I can be in New York, where I live, playing against somebody who lives in Seoul. You can't do that with golf. Well, I mean, you can with some virtual golf, but it's not the same. Our reach is truly digital. And think about that for a second. It's 100% digital. In an instant, it's global, right? It's not a question of me having to have the challenges of getting 40 players on each team into a room, and that room has to be 100 yards long, and it has to have at least 55,000 people watching it live, and 1 million people tuning in. I can have 2 people in a studio in New York City playing head-to-head, viewed in 175 countries, or I can have a player in New York versus a player in San Francisco, or I can have them playing from their homes on whatever schedule works for them, and the scores are automatically reported. It's just bigger in its potential than anything we've ever seen. And I think that's why the people who've actually studied it and looked at the numbers and looked at the growth pattern, like Daryl, have seen and what we see, which is something that's pretty incredible if you think about it comparative to traditional sport.
I've decided that I know when esports has really made it. One is to get on the viewership. One will be when you have to test for performance-enhancing drugs, because it shows like a level of it's worth it. There's enough money. There's like that'll be when we know.
So now we're talking about determining who the best player or a team in the world is. And at the end of the Blizzard World Championships, Mike, you talked about how you wanted to make it easier for fans at home to determine who is that best player, because there are a number of events and leagues throughout the world. There's maybe 9 or 10 across North America, Europe, and Asia, all with different tournament formats, different player participation, et cetera. So just last year, you had different players winning the Blizzard World Championships, the MLG World Championship, and DreamHack, which is the biggest event in Europe. There were 3 different winners. Only one of those winners had won the Korean Championships, which might arguably be the hardest tournament of any of them. It is really difficult to determine who is the best player. How are you each trying to help alleviate this concern of determining who the best player would be?
Well, we've been spending a lot of time on this issue, and we've been talking to all the various interested parties throughout the ecosystem. I'm not ready to talk about where this is going, but I do feel like it is something that we need to solve, and we want to solve it this year.
Sundance? I mean, it's one of those.
A tease.
So, no, but I think if you look at, there's who's the best? Who's the best on a particular day playing football? Who's the best on clay versus grass versus a hard court? There are variables, right? And so what we have to do is we have to first come up with a structure and a system which standardizes as much as possible. But even in traditional sport, which everyone always points to, Yankee Stadium has different dimensions than Fenway, right? So there's variables within the way that games are played across the board. Home court advantage is a phrase we use for a reason. What we have is we've got the uniqueness of having the opportunity to learn from what's happened in other sports. But the question of who's the best on any particular day is going to be one that's going to come down to having regularly scheduled high-level competition where there's stakes on the line, where there's a method to determine that over time. Because right, as you said right now, if it's disconnected, there's always an argument. I mean, is LeBron James better right now than Michael Jordan was in his prime? We'll never know. They never played against one another in their prime. But the fact that you can have that conversation validates a lot of the interest in the activity. So I like the fact that we had multiple winners last year, because guess what? If we start to solve that a little bit too much, take some of the mystery and some of what it is to be a fan, a fanatic out of it. I want to be able to argue that Marine King is actually the best player. Well, some people will say it's Flash. And what we have to do is give them an opportunity. This is like the Michael Jordan versus the Kobe Bryant, right? These are guys that if you know what we do, those are huge names. We have to give people more opportunity to have those conversations in places like bars and restaurants and at work.
There's a really interesting dynamic that I think who's the best on a particular day kind of does sum it up, because when these guys rise up to the top, StarCraft is a very strategic game. So there's a lot of strategy, and the strategy of the game, the meta game, is evolving over time as people think of new strategies that maybe are very powerful but haven't been done before. And what will happen is when a strategy starts to become dominant, the pros will study that strategy and they'll come up with a counter strategy that can defeat it. And the beauty of StarCraft, and the thing that we really try to achieve, is that for any strategy, there always needs to be a counter. If there's no counter, then that means the game's broken, and we need to fix something about the game, which we can do because it's a digital game and we can patch everybody in the world at the same time. So it's interesting how this might evolve. So maybe one of these guys, maybe partying was the best on a particular day, but maybe 2 months later, he isn't anymore because the metagame has shifted, or because somebody else has practiced so much they've gotten good enough to defeat whatever style he was using.
There are so many different gaming leagues and teams. They're all independently owned, and they aren't so connected with each other besides loose partnerships maybe in the past year, considering MLG with DreamHack and ESL. Is the ecosystem of playing in so many different places to play the right one for esports? And I want to kind of hear what Daryl may have to think of this.
Well, I was on the last thing. I'll get to that because I want to make sure I understand the question. But it doesn't really matter who's best, right? You just need an achievement everyone really cares about, right? You just need something that everyone, maybe they feel like it represents the best. But the reality is, like, it's not the best team that wins every year. The year Dallas beat Miami, yeah, Dallas is better for that 7-game series. But what really matters is they're the champion. They're etched on a trophy. They get a thing. That's what matters. And it has to be very hard to achieve, and it is very hard to achieve. I mean, that's what matters. It seems to me like the main thing you have to avoid, and I think Sundance and I were talking about this, is the splintering of, like, you need like one pinnacle thing, because I think that really drives discussion, viewership, things like that. And you got to avoid chess and boxing, and where you've got you can't let the participants drive when choosing when they can play or not. That's the beauty of MMA. Like they really controlled that. And if the participants get to choose when they get to fight for the title, it's a complete. I mean, it'd be an utter disaster, because all the stuff that comes up. Like, I'm not playing him.
No, that undid boxing. It literally undid boxing.
It undid chess. It undid not that chess. Chess probably had a small room. When Bobby Fischer was gone, there was like a small room of people. It never ended up being a big sport. So your question is like, there's all these different versions of the game, and is that I didn't understand your question.
Well, there's many different leagues, and none of them really work together, only very loosely. Is the ecosystem of players going to all the different events, all independently owned, the right way to go, or do you think we might need to see consolidation?
Well, it's going to consolidate. I mean, I don't even have to answer. Like, it will. It's just who's going to win. That's really the question. So it always consolidates, almost all, and it really comes down to, like, who's going to first get the virtuous cycle of TV revenue coming in that allows you to pay bigger prize money that attracts a better competitor, that brings more revenue in, and then whoever kicks that off first will win. And that's sort of the history of all these sports. And eventually, they end up in the stable 2 leagues, and then they merged, and so it almost always consolidates, and it's just who wins, really.
Do you think that it's going to have to come down to one league, maybe like MLG standing on top of the rest, or do you think there might be room with how competitive gaming is a little bit different here, especially internationally?
There's certainly room now. But I do think it'll consolidate to one at some point.
Well, Daryl, you mentioned one thing in that, which is that you typically have to consolidate, get on television, and then start driving that revenue cycle.
Yeah.
In the world where everything's distributed digitally, how does that change when you don't have a restricted medium that is television?
Yeah, I mean, again, someone's going to get strategic and sign the top, like, as long as there's going to be affinity to players, which is generally something that drives, like, all the more recent leagues, like NASCAR, grew up big and is obviously at their peak. You could argue even declining a little. MMA is now at their pinnacle, and people have affinity to the wrestler. So as long as there's affinity to players, then the winner is going to be the ones who signs these players to exclusive deals. Once there's affinity, I don't know if we even have the affinity cycle to players going yet, but once that's there, whoever gets those players, that's going to drive the interest, and then that's going to kick off that sort of virtuous cycle. I mean, honestly, there's a lot of different examples through history. Bowling, and then they all evolved differently. Some made a peak and then faded. There's a bunch of papers on how different leagues made it or didn't. So I mean, I'm just giving you. I don't even feel like an expert, but I'm just giving you, like, if you talk to the history. Bill James is someone I talked to coming into this panel. He's studied the history of how these leagues form, and he's like back to the 1850s and how military people were playing baseball first and how that evolved. It's just fascinating stuff. And there is some patterns there, but I do think that you make a great point. Like, can we use those past patterns and say that's how it's going to be? I don't know. So I shouldn't sound as certain as I am. I think that's a great point.
Could any of you four maybe compare the uprising of competitive gaming to one of the more mainstream sports now? Is there any singular sport that you think would be the best comparison?
Well, I think we have the advantage, and I don't want to speak for anybody else in the space, but we have the advantage of looking at all of the both successes and failures of the traditional sports media business. You look at the Arena Football League, right? In theory, the Arena Football League is a great idea. It's taking something, it's creating a slight modification on what's an incredibly popular sport and making it more exciting, more energy, more action. But unfortunately, what sounds like a great idea isn't always a great idea in practice. Nobody wanted to advertise, and viewership was non-existent. So to Daryl's point, I think what we have to do is leverage what we've seen historically happen, take a look at how data has driven growth for things like NASCAR, UFC, even the NBA, and get out ahead of that. For us, when we started MLG and to this day, what we looked at honestly was we wanted the lifetime engagement, participation, and revenue profile of PGA, right? We wanted the broadcast stickiness of the NFL, and we wanted the brand awareness and affinity of NASCAR. And according to the studies that we've done with brand lift and association, we are actually better than all of them in unique categories, other than obviously overall mainstream awareness. But for example, we do a partnership with Dr. Pepper. If you say extreme sports to somebody, they might think of Mountain Dew or Monster or NOS, or they'll think of an energy drink typically. We did our first beverage deal, carbonated beverage deal, with Dr. Pepper, and people made fun of me for it. They've been with us now for 6 years. When they did an on-bottle promotion with us on 185 million bottles, sales rose 32% period over period, 16-ounce bottles. So much so that Walmart called me. Walmart noticed.
Walmart doesn't call people. I'll just let you know. People call Walmart.
So it's a big deal, and it's something that, because again, we're unique, right? So NASCAR, we all drive. There's theories around NASCAR. My favorite is we all drive, and so hey, you got that, right? And there's car guys, but we don't drive 135 miles an hour. Baseball, maybe we play it. Football, maybe we played it. Guess what? Go grab an 18-year-old in college right now and ask them if they play StarCraft. The answer is either yes or my roommate does. It's that big. So we're dealing with something that people are engaged with for a far larger period of time. So yeah, we can learn a lot from these leagues, but I don't try and emulate any of them. What I try and do is take the learnings from those moments, those inflection points, and apply them to what we're doing. And yes, TV will be a big part of it, but not in the way that it has traditionally. TV is just going to be, because the way media buyers work is they say, well, I've got TV and digital, and I've got experimental budget. So when we have TV that works for us, not that works for them, we'll be able to tap into that revenue as well, which will help us drive prize purse, which will help us drive more engagement back to the most important thing, which is the controlled distribution through things like Twitch. So
we talked about sponsorship a little bit, and we were talking a little bit before the panel here. How has the attachment rate been for sponsorship throughout the past few years? And maybe compare it to some traditional sports that you've seen.
So again, only to speak for us, but the only time we've ever lost sponsors is when we've gone back and changed the deal to remove exclusivities, right? So again, when you start out with something like eSports, you have to prove the concept first. So you say, hey, Dr. Pepper, we will give you exclusivity against all beverages. And then we go back and we say, now we want energy back, so we can sell that to Coca-Cola for NOS. And now we want coffee, and we want water. So with the exception of when brands have had catastrophic years from a sales perspective, which happens in the consumer packaged goods industry, unfortunately, we've had 85% retention rate on sponsors. NASCAR historically has been the best for that, just because there's so many cars and so many teams. And Procter & Gamble is a great example of somebody who's been involved in that forever. P&G just recently pulled all but a sliver of their sponsorship. Mars pulled it. It's challenging, but again, it's not apples to apples. The reason that those people are able to pull it is because they then look at the media universe and their ability to just advertise on an ESPN or a Fox, and they get the same audience. You don't get that with us. You have to advertise with us. You have to partner with us. You have to work with a Blizzard to become a publisher-level partner. You have to work with a Twitch. You have to think about it differently. Because we're not beholden to Sunday for 2 hours, you can tune in on Channel 5 and watch us. We're an always-on activity that's available. There's appointment viewing, but there's also the view at your leisure component. So I talk to folks all the time. We do research with SRI Institute quite a bit. And we map incredibly favorably. I mean, we are, from a retention standpoint, ahead of the NFL, Major League Baseball, and the NBA for brand association retention amongst our community. Why is that important? Because if you spend with us, people see it. They'll even probably send you an email or tweet at you thanking you for supporting the activity. You don't see that with the NBA. There isn't that personal reaction, that personal engagement, at least as far as I know, unless you're mad at your GM for trading somebody away and not signing somebody. But there's a sense of ownership and within our community, which is unique. And it's a testament to the fact that companies like Blizzard have built IP like StarCraft, that you're a StarCraft fan first, then maybe a league fan, then maybe a player fan. I mean, it's a universe that people are engaging with for a large part of their youth, and it carries over.
And there's a visible awareness in the community of what sponsors are out there supporting these leagues, and they talk about it in the public forums. I know you guys have seen that, but they actually openly discuss, what's the best way to reward these sponsors? Should we write thank you letters to them? Should we buy their products? It's a topic of conversation.
Kevin, Twitch is partnered with nearly all of these leagues and teams and all their sponsors, and Twitch even does sponsoring themselves. Previously, Justin TV, which was a site before Twitch TV, mainly did with social and music and entertainment, and now you've seen Twitch explode with gaming. How have you seen the sponsorship effect, especially with Twitch's compared to Justin?
Sure. I think where we fit in terms of sponsorship for everybody else in the ecosystem, from the leagues to the teams to the individual players, is we really help bolster numbers, right? At the end of the day, what do sponsors care about? Sure, they care about the positive association with a team or a league that they like and they think is good for their brand, but they really want eyeballs. And that's one thing we've been really able to help, particularly leagues, achieve, is by promoting them on the front page, promoting them to our large audience, and even in some sense helping smaller players and smaller teams suddenly launch into the spotlight and reach these critical hundreds of thousands to millions of uniques per month that would then help you garner a sponsorship. So I think that's sort of the role we play. But sort of zoomed out from that, what we're trying to do, what Twitch is trying to do in the marketplace is really tell the overall story of spectating games, and particularly esports. That's the bleeding edge of that culture, and talk about why it's a more engaged audience, why it's a better demographic to reach than, say, a NASCAR. Like, I think there's a great opportunity now. You see people like P&G pulling out a NASCAR. Well, is that good or bad for esports? Hopefully it's good. Hopefully that money stays in digital, and we can tell that story right now alongside the leagues and the teams and the developers, that you want to shift your marketing budget towards esports. So I think that's kind of the role we play there, where we're coalescing everybody and helping tell that story with sort of this big audience as the anchor.
How is the online viewership that you've seen compared to traditional sports?
Good. I mean, I'd say a year ago we were comparing big events like MLG, IPL to minor league sports. I mean, we were really happy when we looked at things like Major League Soccer and X Games, and we looked at it and said, look, these are 250 to 300,000 concurrent viewers on broadcast television on a major network. And we're like, will we ever get there? And we got there really quickly. You know, the IPLs and the MLGs last year, and even some of the smaller leagues achieved that no problem. And this year, towards the end of last year, we started comparing to things like Major League Soccer, which is, you know, not major. It's not an NBA or an NFL, but you can even start comparing stats now to individual MLB games and NHL games. And we're getting into these like millions, you know, 8 to 10 million unique viewers per event. So we're starting to see that.
Sundance, it seems like each event you put on keeps breaking a new record for live viewership. How have you seen it?
Well, there's always a record to pick to break, right? So that's one of the good things. And data, you know, how you frame it is up to you. But it's just growth. I mean, you know, I think one of the things for us is it will become apples to apples, right? The Nielsen change, I don't know how many people are familiar with that. I saw the article that came out earlier, I believe this week or late last week. Nielsen, of course, is the antiquated way to measure television that everyone sells against and buys against for traditional media dollars. They've realized that they've got to get on the bandwagon with digital streaming and digital media, so they're going to start tracking that. That's big. That happened. I believe that that's mostly because of what they've seen in our space and because we've been lobbying so hard for the last 2 years. When that happens, it's not going to be a question of, you know, how did our last event compare to our most recent? It's going to be, how did our game compare to the Rockets game, right? Or how did our game compare to the Sunday, you know, football game on the NFL Network? And it'll be apples to apples. So our growth has been tremendous, over 600% growth in the audience in 2 years, 300% this last year. There's no sign of it slowing. It's just, you know, again, it's the question of getting it out there in a way where the measure that we use is comparable to what the traditional measure is. And
I would add that there are trends really, really helping all sports, and that's you know, you have to watch it at the time. You don't want to hear the results. So I mean, that's something everyone talks about, but it's true in esports as well. It's helping all sports. That content that people have to tune in because it's not as interesting to watch a day later or 2 days later. You can't time shift it. Is really driving a lot of the revenue coming into sports on the viewership side.
So just like the leagues, the teams are all independently owned with independent owners all throughout America, Europe, and Asia. Players are normally contractors and they don't have really a union. In American pro sports, the leagues and teams work very closely together, which is unlike how the current esports climate is. How should this relationship go moving forward? I want to hear what Daryl.
Meaning, what should be the governance structure of the leagues?
Yeah, if you kind of have any brief idea.
I mean, right now it's more like European sort of structure where there's independent teams that can form. There's no, I don't think you turn away teams if they form and enter. You let them in, you know, whereas, you know, no one can just form an NBA club and start playing. So it's more of a European model in governance, and there are advantages and disadvantages to both. I think the American model is shown to be better on the revenue side generally, where you get to some continuous affinity. Even relegation, which for me is a lot of fun. Like if you're so bad, like you're out. You're not even in the major league anymore. I think it's fun. I think the North American sort of model for NHL, MLB, NFL, NBA has proven to be superior in that realm over time in terms of total driving of affinity and viewership. So I don't know how it'll evolve. I mean, you know, on a revenue side, the North American model has been better, but there are advantages to the European model as well.
And I think one of the big questions that yet to be answered is, does the team model work, or is it more like tennis? Because for the team model to work, you need certain levels, you know, in order for the North American team model to work, you need certain guarantees, right? And where traditional sport, you typically within that you have a home arena, right? You have home media rights. You have, you know, it's a little bit different. With tennis, with the ATP, for example, people travel globally and participate in events where they show up, and they can be part of a team, or a sponsorship group, or an agency. But you know, again, the word team in the traditional sense does not necessarily apply.
When I first came into it, I was surprised there were teams.
Yeah.
That didn't like intuitively. coming in, I wouldn't have expected it.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, none of the teams have the same business model. None of the, I mean, it's, yeah, we'll see. We'll see what
It's
happens.
almost like forced affinity, the teams, a little bit. Like that there's no natural teams, right? There's no, it's literally like whoever can bring in sponsor dollars creates teams right now.
Yeah.
But there's no like natural geography or natural anything that connects these teams, except, like some of them are all made of some are all Korean, some
Yeah.
are all, so there's that. But I've found the team thing is interesting. I'm not sure that is the best way to go.
Yeah, I think with what we're working on and what we have planned and the direction, I think in the next year and a half, 2 years, it'll shake out a lot. It's just, again, right now it is because it's been built. It's been built without kind of a central core, central structure for everyone. So once those things start to get answered, I think the team stuff will sort itself out naturally.
In an ideal world, what would you see the relationship being between the teams, the players, and the leagues? Do you think we should be coming to a more American-focused model that we see in sports, or do you think it might be the more European soccer model?
Yeah, I don't have an answer that I'm comfortable committing to because of the fact that I think structurally with what we're doing and some of the things that we have planned that we haven't announced or we can't really talk about, again, there'll be a clear path that's provided within that. I do think that there needs to be level setting in terms of what the requirements would be for there to be a team. I mean, Rod, you could start a team tomorrow, right? Let's say you talk a player and just putting a jersey on. Is that enough? Can we allow it to be enough? Can we then allow your brands that you're talking to? Let's say you decide you want a new water brand, and so you put that on his jersey, but there's actually no product to sell. Does that devalue the opportunity as we go out to media partners? I mean, there are bigger questions and broader questions that will be answered. But I think that, again, just like everything else that we do, we're going to take the information that's available from what's happened in North America, Europe, and Asia and create what works best for our application, a global application.
Based on what the NBA and other leagues have learned over the past 10 or 15 years, what can eSports learn from them?
She's trying to give you the questions too. So, I missed it, sorry?
Based on what the NBA and other sports have learned over the past 10 to 15 years, what do you think eSports can learn from them?
Well, I don't know if the last 10, 15 years is the right time window. I mean, I think, the time that maybe you can learn from the NBA is, back to the 50s and 60s, not the last 10 or 15 years. I would defend our sport. I do know we do the best in the 18 to 34 demographic among all the major sports. We bring in kids better than any sport. We don't have some of the injury problems that other sports are facing right now. So, I mean, I'm obviously biased, but I think the NBA is going to be one of those few that makes it 50 years from now when we have holographic matches. We're going to also still have the NBA, I think. But yeah, no, I think the NBA evolved in, it was a long period. I know one anecdote, I haven't checked it, so if it's wrong, someone can tell me. But, I heard from the old Celtics, when they were winning, I believe it was their 7th championship, they couldn't sell out the Boston Garden for the final. It was the 6th or 7th. The Bruins outdrew them even though they weren't good at the time. So it just, these things change and evolve and really have feedback loops. And now, obviously, the NBA is way bigger than the NHL. You would never imagine an NBA Finals game not being completely sold out. And it's just because the NBA started later than the NHL. The NHL had a longer time to build up all that affinity. So I think it's past then. And those, there were 2 leagues, they merged. I mean, like all the stuff we're talking about of how things consolidate all happened in the NBA. One big lesson, though, is if you have media rights early, don't sell them off, because the NBA is still paying a Kansas City franchise nearly $500 million a year, because when they sold their franchise, they said, but we're not giving up our media rights, and back then they were worthless, and now they're worth an immense amount of money.
Mike, you have the challenge of actually creating the sport to begin with. What are the biggest challenges Blizzard has to face when, such an overwhelming task?
Well, so in the case of StarCraft 2, we did set out to to make it an esport. And I think one of the most important things, it has to be fair game. It has to be a situation where the best player will more often than not be the winning player. And so that means, in the case of StarCraft, where you have 3 completely separate races that you can choose from that play very differently, balance is incredibly important. And spectatability is really important. And so we wanted to make sure that the observer tools were there so that when a live match is going on, the observers have the ability to get into the game and show the audience what's really happening. And and again, in the case of StarCraft, and we sort of took a cue from poker, because poker, very fun game, not really very fun to watch unless you know more than both of the players. And so, in the case of StarCraft, the audience actually knows everything that's going on in the battlefield. They know every decision that each player is making, and the shoutcasters, the announcers, are basically interpreting all of that information in real time to make it a really enjoyable, exciting experience.
Can I ask a question, Mike?
Yeah.
So when you're setting your game, like one sort of key thing for any game is like how often does the better player beat the worst player? Yeah, and you mentioned poker. I think it's like 55-40. It depends on the skill level difference, but like there's a lot of luck in poker. There's still a lot of skill over time, but a lot of luck. Like how do you guys actually tune that? Like how often do you want the better player to beat the worst player in your sport, and why?
Usually, I mean, if you look at the top pros and their win rates, it's pretty difficult to get over, say, 75%. But in these tournaments, they're not just playing one game and winner takes all. It's usually best of 5, best of 7, especially in the finals. And you do tend to see the same people doing well in these tournaments.
But there's a sweet spot. I mean, a lot of sports you want randomness, like you want uncertainty.
One of the things that, again, to Mike's earlier point, is in terms of the metagame and how it develops. So if we were to play each other and I come out and I have a strategy you've never seen before, I rush you, I can catch you off guard and fluster you and take a game.
Right.
That's always a possibility, right? So it's really interesting is that as tuned as the game is, there are always things that you can do, not to break the game, but to break the strategy that someone's going to roll out with, like bluffing in poker, right? And the metagame, the evolution of the metagame is consistent and constant, where people retire strategies and bring them back over time. One of the things we do, we work with Mike's team incredibly closely. We will take all of the matches from one of our tournaments and hand over the data so they can parse it and they can see what the effective usage of particular units are, if anything maybe is giving someone an unfair advantage, if anybody is taking advantage of something within the map environment. Again, because it's completely digital, every second of every game can be analyzed. There's data points. There's sets that you can create. Again, the community honestly will oftentimes come out because they don't understand it, they don't see the data. But the dialogue that we have is several layers deep around pretty much every component of the game, from unit balance to map creation to best of 1 versus best of 3 versus best of 5. And balancing all that together to create entertainment is essentially what they've committed to and what we do on a daily basis. So I get confused I look at these spreadsheets, it's just like 75% when, it's just tier. It's like, so does that mean I should play Terran? What should I do here? I don't,
It's good if there's no answer, right? You want no answer, yeah.
Well, we look at the win rates of all the races and all the different matchups at every skill level, and we look for anomalies where we see that, if any one combination has some type of unfair advantage, and then we'll try to understand why that was and fix it. But I think the design team actually does pretty well.
So most traditional sports have been around for decades, if not a century, with smaller tweaks along the way. We're not going to see a basketball 3 or a hockey 4 anytime soon. So can games such as StarCraft thrive as sports when there is a new iteration of the game with possible major changes along the way?
Well, we're not going to keep making major changes indefinitely. I think in this case we have an opportunity to make some changes, and I think we're targeting those changes to improve the overall game, I think make it a little bit more exciting, address some of the weaknesses that we've seen evolve in the metagame over the last 2 years. But we're sort of approaching some equilibrium, some steady state that StarCraft II will live with for a long time.
I think if you look at traditional sport in the last 5 to 10 years, especially, or 5 years, some of them, there have been significant changes. Right? The NBA moving a three-point line, or allowing zone defense, or changing rules in the NFL to favor quarterbacks. Baseball is, I don't want to talk about drug testing, but there's constantly changes there in terms of the way the game is played. But the challenge that all those sports have is, if any one change they make, there's an outrage, right? It's a huge change to fundamental. Is it valid? When they wanted to have the new ball in basketball, just took Shaquille O'Neal saying, "Hey, I can't hold it." They're like, "Okay, we won't." We can get out ahead of it. We can actually make these changes without. People will still complain, but the fact of it is, because of the nature of the data that we have, we can then say, "This is why." But again, TV timeouts in basketball. An NFL game being broken down to, they've done studies where 70% of the time the players are standing on the field, there's no action at all. That's not rife for change, rapid change, in order to make it more compelling to people who aren't already fans. They're just trying to keep the fan base they have and sustain what they have. Whereas what we're doing is we're building something that's going to be scaling, for the next, several decades. Change is good.
Kevin, live streaming might be considered one of the largest aspects of the growth of esports, of any of the different factors here. Why has esports excelled so much over live streaming over maybe any other industry?
Yeah, I think it was the only good distribution platform for what we're doing, right? It just wasn't, it's not made for television. It's not something fundamentally made for television yet. When it comes to, tournaments, the structure of the tournament just doesn't work for online. You think about traditional sports are actually designed with television in mind, commercial breaks. You look at your average 30 minutes of television, you get 8 minutes of advertising. It's even more dense for a lot of sports, particularly towards the end of the game in the fourth quarter. You can't get that. I mean, you can't get that in esports. There's certain games that run 40 minutes to an hour, and there's no natural break in there. So there's not really any good excuse, or not good excuse, good reason, good method to put that on television currently. On top of that, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why I think live streaming is really important for esports, but it's global. It's a global phenomenon. As Sundance mentioned, we're reaching pretty much every country in the world with broadband internet is tuning in to watch this. All over the world, 600,000 people every single month attempt to create content. You can't do that anywhere else. And I think the reason why entertainment and sports and music hasn't really excelled as quickly is because they have plenty of other distribution mechanisms, television, radio, for instance. Live concerts for music, live sports events. You can go to those things. You can't get that really with gaming yet. I mean, you can get the live event experience now, but it just wasn't accepted on television, and I think that's why live streaming really took off. But it's also, high definition. You want high definition distribution globally, and you want to be able to do it easily. Right now, this industry is so nascent, you can't strike all those licensing deals with the various cable operators around the world, the various MSOs. Not to mention, you don't have the production. It's a high production cost to do that, to translate into every single language, where what live streaming allows you to do is to say, okay, well, I'm going to produce one event. I'm going to get 8 other people to cast it, recast it in a different language. It's a single point of contact, one distribution point, and then we distribute it all over the world. And on top of that, we add this revenue mechanism to bolster it from the ground up. Players are able to make revenue streaming on Twitch. Teams are able to get sponsorships streaming on Twitch, and of course, leagues as well.
Is getting on television necessary for esports to move forward towards the mainstream?
I would argue no. I mean, I think validation is already there. There's already this huge global audience tuning in to watch it online, and you think about in American homes, your Xbox has become your video platform of choice. Not even to mention your PC. Your Xbox, an average Xbox owner spends 4.5 hours watching video on Xbox, not even playing games. Like, you tack on the gameplay on top and you're looking 6-7 hours a day, entertainment associated with your Xbox. That's already as much as traditional cable viewing. For us, our goal is to get, it is a lean back experience, right? So the main difference between what we do at Twitch versus a VOD platform is it's lean back, it's long form viewing, and we want that. We want to get on smart TVs. We announced the Xbox app. We want to make it easy for you to watch wherever you are, mobile, PC, or your traditional television experience. So I think the fact that that technology is going to be available in that experience means that it's not a necessity to be on television.
But you couldn't handle a Super Bowl. I mean, you just can't handle live streaming a Super Bowl, right? So the answer is like you'd want it to have to be on TV, but by the time you're that big, it might be that the live streaming tech has gotten to the point where you can actually handle, I don't even know, like Super Bowl's an extreme example, but even like a major event would be hard to handle the total number of viewers, right?
Well, I mean, look at baseball, right? So baseball's on television. There's 162 games this season. How many of the Kansas City Royal games are available outside of market, right? And unless you have a package that you're paying extra for everything, you know, it's a question of the velocity at which the content can be consumed versus the desire for there to be content, right, produced. So I think TV is, we've done TV in the past, we've been on TV in the past, and we'll be on TV in the future, but it's just one more avenue. And until it's as good or better than what's currently available, there's no reason to rush to it. I think a lot of, you know, the way that rights media deals happen, we're in conversations all the time, but somebody's going to approach us and write us a big check, and we're going to offer them up a piece of one of our events as opposed to our season, because we can do that. We can do what it took the NFL decades to do, you know, pretty early on. We can have content that's licensed out plus controlled distribution mechanism. Right? We can have our own network, and we can have multiple networks that are going to be broadcasting our content, because we're a new sport for a new generation.
I think the final question, as we only have 1 minute remaining, is what is our sport, eSports, the biggest areas of opportunities heading into 2013 and beyond? I would like to hear from each of you. Let's go down the road.
Okay,
yeah.
all right. So I think it's just the continuation of mainstreaming and standardizing what the experience is. All right, it's one of those things where if you ask somebody what the NFL is, they have a very clear answer. But for us, there are multiple players in space, there are multiple titles. I think it's a more hand-in-hand cooperation and partnership with our publishing partners and with our development partners to be able to solidify that answer to not just the current fan base, but the future fan base. You know, I'm a big fan. Obviously, I'm bullish on it. I've been doing it for a while. But the last 3 years have been unlike anything I've ever seen, and I'm a historian when it comes to studying the paths of traditional sports media businesses. And to me, it is a question of not even doing more, but just, in terms of more content or more activity, but doing more to solidify the base, the core, so that it's a sustainable business, so that it's a healthy business, so that there's revenue scale, there's audience scale, and that the mainstream appeal continues to grow. So essentially, you know, more of what we currently have, and less fracturing of the space.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think, you know, you mentioned right at the beginning, we're still very early in development of esports, and I really think it's just the beginning, and it's just going to become more and more accessible and mass market.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that, and I mean, you know, I think the specific to a platform like us goals for 2013 really are to get more developers involved as a way to get into that mainstream audience more directly, to tap into their existing gaming communities. But beyond that, you know, it's exactly what sort of Sundance said earlier. It's, you know, it's figuring out the way to get this into the mainstream if we think that's the appropriate outlet to reach more viewers, and then retaining those viewers. I mean, you may be able to touch on mainstream, but if you don't touch in the right format, you're not gonna draw those folks in. So one thing we're trying to work on is, you know, obviously retention, but the interactivity around this experience, which makes it further unique to traditional sports, right? Where you look at television, whether it's, you know, entertainment or sports or music, what are they trying to do? They're trying to build these social components around it. You got companies like GetGlue and Miso. They're trying to get you to interact not only with the TV, the show, but the advertisements. So I think we have actually a really unique opportunity to drive value back to both of those things.
I'm betting on whatever secret thing they have cooked up. Not sure what it is. That sounds good. So that's my bet on next year. So.
All right. Well, thank you guys for the panel. And are we able to do Q&A? A little bit? No? All right. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Sundance, Mike, and Kevin.